My name is Victoria. I am 33 years old, and for the past 7 years, I have worked as a senior forensic auditor and partner at an institutional capital advisory firm. 36 hours ago, on a freezing Thanksgiving evening, 32 members of my extended family sat around a 30-foot banquet table in the formal dining room of my parents' suburban home on Highcrest Ridge. In the center of the table was a 20-pound roasted turkey, surrounded by silver serving trays, crystal wine goblets, and vintage porcelain china. At the head of the table sat my father, Thomas, wearing his bespoke tailored wool blazer, radiating the arrogant, commanding aura he had used to control every person in his orbit for 40 years. To his right sat my younger brother, Brandon, wearing an expensive gold watch my father had bought him 2 weeks earlier, smirking across the table at me as the family finished their second course. Then, my father tapped his silver dessert fork against his crystal water glass 3 times. The ringing sound cut through the chatter, bringing the entire dining room to an immediate silence. He did not raise a toast to family unity. He did not thank his guests for traveling across the country. Instead, he stood up, pulled a certified legal document with an embossed county probate stamp from his breast pocket, and looked directly down the length of the table at me. "Before we bring out the pies," my father's voice boomed across the room, deliberate and steady enough for every aunt, uncle, cousin, and in-law to hear, "I have a formal announcement regarding the Thomas Vance family trust and estate. 2 days ago, in the presence of my legal counsel, I executed a total revision of my last will and testament. Every residential asset, the Highcrest estate, our liquid commercial portfolios, and all future family holdings have been assigned exclusively to Brandon. Victoria has made it abundantly clear over the last 7 years that she considers herself superior to this household. Therefore, Victoria, your name has been permanently and unconditionally removed from the will. You receive 0. You have 24 hours to remove whatever personal boxes you left in the attic and vacate this property. You owe this family your silence." The silence in that dining room was suffocating. My mother, Eleanor, looked down at her plate with a tight, satisfied smile, smoothing her napkin. Brandon let out a soft chuckle, raising his wine glass toward his cousins in a silent victory toast. Several aunts and uncles shifted uncomfortably in their seats, looking away in embarrassment. I sat at the far end of the table in my charcoal blazer. I did not drop my fork. I did not blush. I did not shed a single tear. I took a slow sip of sparkling water and set the glass down on the white linen tablecloth. My father stood tall, puffing his chest out, convinced he had just delivered the ultimate public humiliation. He believed he had broken the rebellious daughter who had spent 7 years refusing to fund his reckless financial schemes. What my father completely forgot, and what the gray-haired gentleman sitting in the corner armchair of the dining room was about to prove 90 seconds later, was that he was not the only person who had hired an estate attorney. Sitting quietly near the fireplace was Arthur Pendleton, the 81-year-old senior managing partner of Pendleton and Associates, the firm that had overseen my grandfather's original estate for over 4 decades. Arthur stood up from his leather chair, adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles, and placed a thick, sealed manila envelope marked with 2 official red wax seals onto the center of the dining table. "Thomas," Arthur said, his voice dry, calm, and carrying the weight of 50 years in probate law. "Before you conclude your Thanksgiving address, there is a second envelope. And unlike your revised draft, this document is an irrevocable master testamentary conveyance, executed by your late father, Charles Vance, in 2012. And under Clause 4 of that conveyance, you never possessed the legal authority to bequeath a single brick of this estate." To understand why my father's face turned from smug arrogance to a shade of chalky, suffocating gray, you have to rewind 7 years. You have to understand how our family functioned for 3 decades. In the Vance family, there were 2 classes of children, the asset and the idol. I was the asset. Brandon was the idol. Brandon was 3 years younger than me. From childhood, he was treated by my parents as though his mere presence was a gift to humanity. If Brandon failed 3 classes in high school, my father hired private tutors to do his homework and blamed the school curriculum. If Brandon was expelled from his first private university for academic dishonesty and destroying a dormitory lounge, my mother claimed the administration was jealous of his wealthy background. Whenever Brandon wanted a new luxury sports car, a vacation to St. Moritz, or a $100,000 cash infusion for a nightclub promotion venture that failed in 6 weeks, my father wrote the check without hesitation. Meanwhile, I was expected to be the tireless workhorse. I started working at 14, keeping the books for my grandfather's commercial lumber yards on Saturdays and scrubbing floors in his warehouse. My grandfather, Charles Vance, was a self-made industrialist who built the family's wealth from scratch through 40 years of grueling, 70-hour workweeks. Unlike my father, who inherited a cushy executive vice presidency and treated money like water, grandfather Charles was frugal, disciplined, and possessed a razor-sharp eye for character. When I was 18, grandfather Charles sat me down in his wood-paneled study and told me, "Victoria, your father has a champagne appetite and a ditch-digger's work ethic. He lives to impress people he hates with money he didn't earn. And your brother Brandon is being raised to be a parasite. Never put your name on their debts, never let them manage your labor, and remember that real ownership belongs to those who do the work." When I went to college to study corporate finance and forensic accounting, my father refused to pay for my tuition, stating that Brandon needed private flight lessons in Florida. Grandfather Charles paid every dollar of my tuition directly to the university bursar. When grandfather passed away in 2015, my father immediately moved his family into grandfather's crowning achievement, the Highcrest Ridge Estate, an 8-bedroom stone manor sitting on 12 acres of prime woodland. My father assumed that because he was the only living son, the entire fortune was his personal playground. After graduating with top honors, I spent 6 years working 80-hour weeks at an elite institutional restructuring firm downtown. I slept in a modest 1-bedroom apartment, wore simple clothes, and saved 90% of my earnings. By age 27, I had mastered corporate debt auditing, forensic tax tracing, and institutional trust structures. Then came the crisis of 2019. My father and Brandon launched a private real estate development syndicate called Vance Apex Holdings. Without running proper feasibility studies, they borrowed $2.4 million from an aggressive commercial mezzanine lender to construct a luxury boutique golf resort. Because Brandon was named Chief Marketing Officer, the venture was a disaster from day one. Brandon spent $400,000 on private jet travel, luxury launch parties, and celebrity endorsements, but failed to secure the basic municipal zoning and environmental permits. Within 18 months, the development project collapsed into total insolvency. The mezzanine lender issued a formal notice of acceleration, demanding the immediate repayment of $2.8 million in principal, interest, and default penalties. My father called me into the Highcrest study on a rainy Tuesday evening. He had 5 separate loan consolidation documents laid out across grandfather's antique oak desk. "Victoria," my father said, leaning back with a patronizing grin. "You work in high finance restructuring. You have excellent institutional credit and substantial private liquidity. We have arranged for you to co-sign on a $3 million restructuring bond to pay off the mezzanine lender. You will also pledge your firm's equity shares as secondary collateral. This will protect your brother's commercial reputation and keep Vance Apex Holdings alive." I looked at the balance sheets. The company was bleeding $40,000 a month. There were 0 assets, 0 revenue, and massive unhedged liabilities. "Dad," I said calmly, "Vance Apex Holdings is commercially bankrupt. Brandon committed gross managerial negligence. If I put my name on this restructuring bond, the lenders will liquidate my private assets within 6 months. The answer is no. You need to file for Chapter 11 corporate restructuring and let Brandon face the bankruptcy court." My father stood up, knocked his crystal whiskey tumbler against the desk, and screamed until the veins in his neck bulged. "How dare you give me business advice?" he roared. "You got that fancy job because of the Vance name. Brandon is trying to build an empire, and you are sitting on your high horse refusing to help your own family. If you don't sign these papers, you are dead to me. I will strip you of every dime of your inheritance. I will make sure you are left with nothing. You can threaten me all you want, Dad," I replied, standing up and gathering my coat. I built my career without your money, and I will not throw my life into a fire to fund Brandon's vanity. I walked out of the house. For the next 7 years, my father and mother treated me like a pariah. They told our entire extended family that I was an ungrateful, disloyal daughter who had attempted to steal my brother's business opportunities and abandoned the family during a minor corporate reorganization. Whenever I attended family funerals or holiday gatherings, my mother made sure I was seated at the far end of the table with distant cousins, while Brandon was celebrated as the future patriarch. Meanwhile, my father did what he always did. He took out massive private loans against the Highcrest estate to settle the mezzanine lawsuit out of court, sinking deeper into a catastrophic web of high-interest liens. Over those 7 years, I did not retaliate with anger. I didn't send nasty text messages, and I didn't engage in family gossip. Instead, I met with Arthur Pendleton every 6 months in his downtown law office. We reviewed the master probate files, the land registries, the tax assessments, and the original corporate charters established by my grandfather Charles in 2012. And what Arthur and I knew, what had been locked inside Pendleton and Associates' high-security vault for over a decade, was that grandfather Charles had anticipated my father's exact trajectory 20 years before it happened. Which brings us back to Thursday evening around the Thanksgiving banquet table. My father stood at the head of the table, his chest puffed out, clutching his rewritten will, basking in the silence he had created after announcing that his eldest daughter had been stripped of her inheritance. Then, Arthur Pendleton stepped forward from the shadows of the fireplace, holding the sealed manila envelope with the red wax seals. "Arthur," my father barked, annoyed by the interruption. "What is the meaning of this?" "I already had our family lawyer draft the disinheritance paperwork on Tuesday. The matter is closed." Arthur did not flinch. He adjusted his glasses, picked up a silver letter opener from the side credenza, and sliced open the red wax C. LS with slow, deliberate precision. "Thomas," Arthur said, his dry voice echoing across the silent table. "The draft you signed on Tuesday is legally worthless. You cannot bequeath an estate that you do not own." My father scoffed, letting out a loud, mocking laugh. "What are you talking about, Arthur? You're losing your mind in your old age. My father built Highcrest Ridge. I am his sole surviving son. I inherited this property under the 2015 probate settlement." Arthur pulled a 14-page parchment document bearing the golden embossed seal of the State Supreme Court Probate Division from the envelope. "Under the 2015 probate settlement, Thomas, you were granted a temporary, conditional life tenancy in Highcrest Ridge, subject strictly to the terms of the Charles Vance Irrevocable Generation-Skipping Dynasty Trust of 2012. Arthur turned to page 7 of the document and held it up under the chandelier light. Clause 4, Section B, Arthur read aloud with crystal clarity. "The life tenancy granted to Thomas Vance shall immediately terminate, without right of cure, upon the occurrence of any of the following statutory triggers. First, the encumbrance of the property with unauthorized secondary debt exceeding $500,000. Second, the declaration of insolvency by any commercial entity bearing the family name. And third, any attempt by the life tenant to disinherit, alienate, or diminish the legal succession of the designated primary remainder trustee." Arthur lowered the paper and looked directly at my father over the rims of his glasses. "Who is the designated primary remainder trustee, Arthur?" my father whispered, the smugness completely evaporating from his face, replaced by a sudden, creeping terror. Arthur turned his gaze slowly to the far end of the table. "The sole primary remainder trustee, vested with 100% fee simple ownership of Highcrest Ridge, all underlying acreage, and the master family trust capital, is your daughter, Victoria Vance." The silence in that dining room did not last 3 seconds. It lasted 22 seconds. I counted every single swing of the grandfather clock in the foyer. My mother dropped her crystal wine glass. It shattered against her porcelain dinner plate, spilling dark red wine across the white linen tablecloth like a pool of blood. Brandon's fork slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. He stared at Arthur, his mouth hanging open in complete, paralyzed shock. My father's hands began to shake so violently that the paper he was holding fluttered in the air. His face turned from red to an ashen, sickly gray. He gripped the edge of the table to keep himself from collapsing. "No," my father stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate gasp. "No. That's impossible. That trust was supposed to be dissolved upon my father's death. Charles wouldn't do this to me. I am his son." "Your father knew exactly who you were, Thomas," Arthur replied coldly. "Charles spent 40 years building this family's fortune. He knew that if he left the capital in your hands, you and Brandon would gamble it away on vanity projects within a decade. He designated Victoria because Victoria was the only member of this family who possessed the intelligence, discipline, and integrity to preserve what took a lifetime to build." Brandon jumped to his feet, knocking his chair backward, shouting across the table, "This is fraud. This is a setup. Victoria put Arthur up to this. Dad, tell him to get out of our house." "Sit down, Brandon," I said softly. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a razor blade. Brandon froze, looking at me with wild, panicked eyes. I stood up from my chair at the end of the table, smoothed down my charcoal blazer, and picked up a dark blue leather portfolio that Arthur had brought with him. "You wanted to talk about who is being removed from what, Dad?" I said, projecting my voice so that every single relative around that table could hear every syllable. "Let's review the facts." I opened the blue portfolio and laid out 3 certified documents directly in front of my father. "Document number 1, I said, pointing to the top page. "On March 14, 2021, you secretly took out a $1.2 million private mezzanine lien against Highcrest Ridge to settle Brandon's defaulted nightclub and golf venture lawsuits. Under Clause 4 of Grandfather's Trust, the moment you executed that unauthorized lien, your conditional life tenancy was automatically revoked by operation of law." My father stared at the document, his chest heaving, unable to utter a single word. "Document number 2, I continued, sliding the next page forward. 14 months ago, the private mezzanine lender initiated foreclosure proceedings against this estate. Rather than allowing Grandfather's house to be auctioned off on the courthouse steps to pay for Brandon's failures, my capital advisory firm purchased the entire promissory note, the underlying mortgage, and all tax liens in cash for $1.4 million. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat on the mahogany table, looking directly into my father's bloodshot, terrified eyes. "For the past 14 months, Dad, you, Mom, and Brandon have been living in this house not as owners, not as patriarchs, but as unauthorized occupants living rent-free on my personal property." My mother burst into hysterical sobs, grabbing my father's arm. "Thomas. Tell her she's lying. Tell me we aren't losing the house. Where are we supposed to go?" My father fell heavily back into his armchair, his hands trembling against his face, completely shattered. The towering, intimidating patriarch who had spent 40 years using money and inheritance to bully his children had been reduced to a broken old man sitting in a chair he didn't own. Brandon rushed around the table, his face flushed with panic, reaching out to grab my hand. "Victoria, please. Vic, listen to me." Brandon pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "We're brother and sister. We made mistakes with the business, but we can fix this. You have millions of dollars. You can just sign a waiver and let us keep living here. We can manage the property together. You can't throw your own family out on Thanksgiving." I pulled my hand back, stepping out of his reach. 30 minutes ago, Brandon, I said, looking him dead in the eyes, "you sat at this table smirking while Dad told 30 people that I was getting zero, that I had 24 hours to remove my boxes from the attic, and that I was dead to this family. You didn't say a word to defend me. You raised your wine glass and celebrated." Brandon swallowed hard, tears welling in his eyes. "I was just going along with Dad. You know how he is. Please, Victoria, I have no money, I have no credit, and my car lease is past due. If you kick us out, I will be on the street." "Then I suggest you get a job, Brandon," I replied calmly. "Because the trust will no longer be funding your lifestyle. I reached into the portfolio, pulled out a formal legal document with the red seal of the County Sheriff's Civil Enforcement Division, and placed it next to my father's untouched turkey dinner. Document number 3, I announced. This is a formal notice of termination of occupancy and demand for immediate surrender of premises. Because it is Thanksgiving, I will not have the county deputies escort you off the property tonight. I looked at my father, then at my mother, and finally at Brandon. You have until Monday morning at precisely 9 a.m. to pack your personal clothing, your personal effects, and vacate Highcrest Ridge. At 9:01 a.m., the locks will be changed, the security gates will be rekeyed, and any person remaining on the grounds will be arrested for criminal trespassing. My father looked up from his hands, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Victoria, please. Have mercy. I am your father. I looked at the man who had spent 7 years trying to destroy my dignity. I am showing you mercy, Dad, I said quietly. Mercy is giving you 4 days to pack your things instead of calling the sheriff tonight. But justice is allowing you to experience the exact reality you tried to force on me. I turned to the 30 extended family members sitting around the table, who were staring in absolute, stunned silence. I apologize for the interruption to your dinner, I said politely. The catering staff has been paid in full for the evening. Please enjoy your meal. I turned on my heel, walked out of the formal dining room, through the grand foyer, and stepped out into the crisp, clear evening air. Arthur Pendleton walked out beside me, resting a gentle hand on my shoulder. Your grandfather would be very proud of you tonight, Victoria, Arthur said with a warm smile. He always said you were the only one who inherited his spine. Thank you, Arthur, I replied, taking a deep breath of the cold winter air. Over the next 4 days, the collapse of my father's illusion was total and absolute. On Friday and Saturday, moving vans arrived at Highcrest Ridge. My father, mother, and Brandon spent 72 hours hauling boxes of clothes, personal photos, and suitcases out of the master suites, watched over by a private security detail Arthur had dispatched to ensure no historical furnishings or trust art pieces were removed. Brandon was forced to sell his luxury sports car back to the dealership at a massive loss to pay for a deposit on a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial edge of town, where he and my parents moved on Sunday evening. On Monday morning at 9 a.m., I arrived at Highcrest Ridge with Arthur and a commercial locksmith. The house was completely silent. The keys were left on the mahogany dining table next to an empty centerpiece. I did not sell Highcrest Ridge to a real estate developer. I did not bulldoze the woods. I established the Charles Vance Memorial Foundation, dedicated to providing educational scholarships and vocational training for young women entering corporate finance, accounting, and industrial engineering. The Grand Stone Manor was converted into a permanent retreat and research center for working-class scholars who, like me, were building their own futures from the ground up without family safety nets. Over the last 6 months, my mother has attempted to send letters through my firm's administrative portal, claiming that my father's health has deteriorated and begging for monthly trust allowances. Arthur handled every single communication with a one-sentence legal response. The Charles Vance Trust operates strictly under the governance of its primary trustee, and no funds shall be disbursed to individuals who violated its terms. They never wrote again. People often ask if seeing my family lose everything brought me happiness. The truth is, it didn't bring me joy. It brought me peace. There is a profound difference between cruelty and boundaries. Cruelty is using power to hurt people who are defenseless. Boundaries are simply holding up a mirror to people who spent decades abusing their power, and stepping out of the way so they can finally collide with the consequences of their own choices. You do not owe your life savings, your labor, or your dignity to people who only view you as a resource to be exploited. Family is not defined by who shares your blood, it is defined by who treats you with respect, honor, and accountability. When someone announces that you have no place at their table, do not beg for a seat. Build your own table, by the room, and let them realize too late that the foundation they were standing on was yours all along. If you were in my position around that Thanksgiving table, would why? Oh, you have allowed your father to stay in the house, or did they get the exact lesson in reality they deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.